Good afternoon. Welcome to this installment of Creation Justice Webinars. I am Brooks Berndt, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by the Reverend Michael Malcom, who carries the torch of justice in Birmingham, Alabama, where he is the Executive Director for both the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, so good to have you. When we first started talking about doing a webinar on this subject, it was about 6 weeks ago. And in pandemic years, that was like 1988.
Yeah.
It's a totally different world, it seems like now, before all this recent wave of protest. And so back then we talked about protest. The image that came to my mind was people driving in their cars around the state capitol honking their horn. And now we're in a very different place, and I'm so glad we picked this topic. Before we jump into introducing our three outstanding panelists for today, would you like to give us a theological framing for our conversation?
Yeah, Rick. Brooks, forgive me. First, let me say thank you all for being here with us. Thank you to our panelists as well as our guests. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. These are the words by the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I also heard it said somewhere something like this: solidarity has to do with understanding the interconnections that exist between oppression and privilege, between the rich and the poor, the oppressed and the oppressors. It also refers to the cohesiveness that needs to exist among communities of struggle. Solidarity happens when you can see your struggle and my struggle and decide to join me in collective liberation. Today, on this call, we are joined by several activists, whether they be activists through the physical mandate or it's the mental mandate, whether it be in the streets or in the academic halls. But either way it goes, we're all activists and we're all working for liberation. You'll find several different ways in that today. And my reason for opening the way that I did and speaking of solidarity in the way that I did is because we'll see that we can all come out of our silos and we can work together. And as long as we're working together for the collective liberation of us all, then we'll work in solidarity, liberation, and justice to all people. This should be and is being led by communities of faith all over the place, because at the end of the day, this is not a question of economics. It's not even a question of policy. It's a question of morals. Is it right or wrong to have those who are least and left out to continue to carry the burden for us who have more? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. As always, a powerful reflection to get us rooted and grounded as we begin this hour together. I'm now going to introduce our three panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. Up first, we will have Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick. Austin is a professor who embodies a scholarship with a moral compass and a passion for justice. His scholarship focuses on social change. His books include What Slaveholders Think, as well as From Human Trafficking to Human Rights. His new book, coming out at the end of July, is The Good Drone. It explores how social movements are using new technologies in good ways. He is an associate professor at both the University of San Diego and the University of Nottingham. Last semester, he was a visiting scholar at Yale. Up next, we will have Sophia Benrud. Sophia is a Black, multiracial queer community organizer, postpartum doula, and a chef residing in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Sophia is the environmental justice organizer and co-founder of Black Visions, a Black-led queer and trans-centering organization committed to strengthening community and community-led safety. Sophia is committed to transforming the current movement by centering communities directly impacted by these issues while building stronger movements to break down systemic violence. And then finally, our last but not least, we will have Lindsay Harper. She is the National Core Support Team Coordinator for Arm in Arm of the U.S. Climate Action Network. Arm in Arm organizes communities for a transformational movement to address the climate crisis by centering economic and racial justice. She is formerly the executive director of Georgia Women's Action for New Directions, a grassroots women-led multiracial organization addressing a range of issues related to the environment and systemic violence. We are delighted to have all three of those panelists. And now we will turn things over first to Austin to get us started. Austin, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here, and to all of you all who are joining us now, and then I'm sure watching this later as well. Coming to you all, I guess we're all coming together in uncertain and unsettling times that are simultaneously horrifying, exhilarating, and I think have the edges of some hope on them. And I think I'm going to touch on a few of those things in the next couple of minutes. So I first, I think, got contacted to be part of this panel because together with some colleagues, I had asked a question at the very beginning of the COVID at the beginning of when the pandemic was just turning into a lockdown, asking questions like, what is collective action and solidarity and protest look like in the middle of a global shutdown? And I'm a social movement scholar. That's what I do work on, how people get together, mobilize for change. And when I say get together and mobilize for change, I have a certain number of things I think about. You probably do as well. And most of them involve us getting together in solidarity to do real things in real time with real people for real change. And then all of a sudden the world shuts down. So what happens next? So we started this project, together with colleagues Jeremy Pressman and Erica Chenoweth, who run something called the Crowd Counting Consortium. They do great work counting how many people are at protests ever since 2017 here in the United States. And Dana Fisher, whose latest book is American Resistance, is looking at social movement activity, especially protests on the streets. So these are really experts in this field. And I reached out to that community and said, what do we know about how those more traditional on-the-ground mobilizations pivot during the pandemic? And they scratched their heads, we scratched our heads. We didn't scratch one another's heads because social distancing, but what it led to was a conversation that produced a whole bunch of new tactics. We reached out to the community and said, help us crowdsource how people are mobilizing during COVID, during the pandemic. We got lots of contributions that I think will be familiar to you all, banging of pots and pans, clapping, car parades, people doing walkouts, protests, and marches 6 feet from one another. We saw people who were for a reopening of governments and economies and society showing up without masks in Lansing, Michigan, for example. So we saw a lot of this sort of traditional social movement protest efforts that we are familiar from the past, some of them going online, some of them adapting in the face of the pandemic. And this is really what we're seeing through April and May. And then, of course, in May, we hit May 21st, the 25th, and then a lot of things change because we had seen fewer people on the streets, we'd seen car parades, we'd seen protests where people were standing, 6 feet apart, as I mentioned. But after the killing of George Floyd, then the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, all this wonderful mobilization work that had happened over the preceding years, the years and years and years of labor, going back decades, but then in particular after Ferguson, this groundwork had been laid for a for seemingly out of nowhere for movements to emerge on the streets. So all of a sudden, as a social movement scholar, we've gone from this pandemic lockdown and asking how are people going to mobilize online, and what is this going to change for the online for social movements moving forward? And then after May 25th, the conversation changes yet again to how is it that the United States is going to respond? How is dominant culture going to respond to systemic racism? And I don't know if the moment I'm speaking to you in right now is a new and third moment where the country is somehow opening up and then maybe contracting again in this COVID moment, and we're having larger conversations about inequality, racial injustice, and about the police systems that are currently the leading edge of white power, in my estimation. So I'm coming to you again from unusual times, and that's sort of why it is that I'm here part of this conversation. But I wanted to point out a couple of things that we've noted from this work that we've done that I think apply to both of these two phases, both this early phase of innovation during the pandemic and also this return to the streets during Black Lives Matter and police accountability movements, protests. So the first is, one of the things social movements do really, really well is solidarity. We see this when people are stepping up together to stand with nurses and first responders during the pandemic. We also see this move for solidarity in sort of diverse and in some cases predominantly white crowds standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think this solidarity is something in both of those two phases we see very, very clearly. The second thing we see across both of these two sort of eras, or both of these two moments, is the pressure to have governments or businesses do something that protesters want, whether it's opening businesses despite COVID or calling for police reform. Protesters on the left and the right call for change that affects institutions. The lesson here, I think, more broadly, is that the pandemic has changed the way we work. We are, after all, doing this right now on these online, platforms that we're all connected to now. And it's changed the way lots of us work and the conditions under which lots of us work, but it hasn't changed the way we protest. We're still showing up in solidarity, sometimes online, sometimes on the streets, and we're trying to apply pressure to see the world change for the better. And so this solidarity and pressure is really, really a constant across these two waves. One thing that has changed, I think, is communication and coordination. We're seeing way more, I think, cross-sectoral collaboration because it's easier to hop on a Zoom call or pick up the phone than it is to show up at a meeting. And so maybe we're part of things we wouldn't have been part of before. So I think if there's a lesson, a takeaway for all of us, is that now is the time to reach across the aisle or to reach across your community or reach out of your strong tie networks and out to others in order to broker new alliances that can be the groundwork both for change in the near term, but also lay the groundwork in the medium to long term when mobilization is needed again. Remember, I said this wave of activism that had sort of gone off the front page post-Ferguson is what laid the groundwork for all of what looked like an all of a sudden mobilization after May 25th. No, that was not, some of that was rage felt at the grassroots, but a lot of it was also on the back of good, solid organizing that's been done by folks who we're going to hear from in a moment. So that communication and coordination has been incredibly important, and online spaces have contributed to innovating in that way. So I think that one of the key takeaways here is coordination and communication and laying further groundwork for what we all know are ongoing struggles. And so I think that this is my major takeaway now is we've gone through this pandemic phase of mobilization. We're in right now I would say, disturbing but more traditional, take it to the streets wave of mobilization. And the question is, how can we keep that momentum up as we enter the general elections and as we maintain a focus on the sorts of reform efforts that we all know are so important and we've struggled so long for. So I'm gonna end there, I think, because that's probably over my allotted time, and I'm happy to answer questions about this at the end. But I'm especially interested in hearing both from Sophia and from Lindsay about this amazing work that they're doing at the grassroots. So I'm gonna go ahead and click mute and thank you all for your time and interest.
Thank you so much, Austin. And we did put in a link to the Guardian article in the chat box. Thank you for that terrific piece, and thank you for the update on where your research and thoughts have gone since then. We'll now transition to Lindsay Harper. Lindsay, we are glad to have you with us today. We introduced you earlier, and we're ready for you to take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. And I do apologize, folks. There was some misunderstanding, miscommunication on my part. So I do apologize for not having been on time and in place. But I did want to share some information. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today and to share some information about Arm in Arm. It's some very exciting work that's been going on with some some individual members of partner groups within the US-CAN membership. There are about I think there are about 18 of us came together about a year or so ago to really look at the ecosystem of the actions and movements that are happening right now in the climate space, and kind of found that there were some gaps. And so kind of looking to come together to really put our heads together and participate in a front-loading process, which is essentially the way that I interpret it, taking all the best pieces of successful movements in the past, putting them together, thinking about them on the front end. And so that when you release the movement out to the people, it's got enough of a structure so that people are saying the same things, but it also allows enough space so that people can customize the movement for themselves and their own individual communities. So Arm in Arm is really, as I say, an opportunity for folks who are, we say 35 and up, okay? There are a lot of young folks, a lot of movements out here for young folks, but for folks who are a little bit older who believe in climate, believe there should be change in policy, but aren't quite plugged in yet. Arm in Arm is an opportunity for folks to, as I say, one, provide a need in their own communities, okay? I know best what's happening on my block. If I see a need, I know that, we need to close up the storm drains because there's a lot of runoff. So that gives me the ability, as part of Arm in Arm, to go out, take a couple of friends and Arm in Arm and to address that need in our community. What we're banking on is that those in power will see our action and have an inappropriate response. Well, you can't stop that storm water. You didn't go through the city. You didn't go through the proper channels to make that happen. So one, you provided the need, you stopped the water. The second part is, well, now we need to have a conversation. Why is it that our current policies in place are not keeping people safe? They're not keeping people healthy. They're not getting people food. They're not getting people fuel. They're not getting people jobs. What can we do? What capacity do we have in our existing communities and our existing neighborhoods to get people what they need, to have those conversations so that we can then draw in other folks who will see, you know what, that didn't make sense that the police came down there and dug up that guerrilla garden that is in that food desert. There's no food in that community. They shouldn't be living in a food desert. So when people went out there to plant food, why is it that the city came and dug it all up? Now, wait a minute, city, you haven't done your job. We shouldn't have any hungry people. That's kind of how I see Arm in Arm working. It is a container to allow people to plug in to get things done. We're looking to scale to 3.5% of the population, of the United States population. It has been shown, as I mentioned to you before, in past movements, and if you can move 3.5% of any population in sustained action and have about 50% of the overall population support those protests, you can get policy moved. That is what Arm in Arm is looking to do. Is to do that in the next 2 years, is to move 3.5% of the US population to get some policy that keeps people safe. And what we're pointing to is a vision for equitable climate action. It is a policy platform that was put together, again, by over 150, I believe, folks who are within the US Climate Action Network membership to help guide how to create policy that makes sense towards a just transition going forward. I hope that's helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions or anything.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And we will have a time for questions right after our third and final panelist. We will transition now to Sophia. Sophia, we are so glad to have you with us. I hear that you have just literally come out of the woods. I don't know if there's a metaphor in there, but glad to have you with us, Sophia. Go ahead.
Hi, y'all. I'm so sorry I'm not on video. I'm like, yeah, it was. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I did just come out of the woods. We actually debriefed a community call we had last night while walking, because we find that just with somatics and stuff like that, like processing things actually is really supportive when you're like moving. Am I just describing? Because I know I'm late.
You're good to go. Just you can share with us lessons that you've gained, and you've got up to the next 10 minutes to just talk about lessons you've gained from the recent protests.
Wow, lessons I've gained from the recent protests. Yes. So first of all, I'm the environmental justice organizer of Black Visions. My main focus historically has been on political education. So I run like a study group every other Tuesday and facilitate with a couple other folks, and then also work on different environmental justice issues. I've been working on like Line 3. I've worked on stuff around the HERC. We actually were the ones that went like alongside some other folks, went through the process of getting someone hired, organizer to fight the HERC incinerator. And as overall like the pandemic has transitioned and changed, I think something that we have put a lot of capacity into specifically was the HERC because of the air, the breathing quality, and the demand is essentially to shut it down permanently, but for right now, shut it down temporarily so that folks can breathe and not have yet another thing to facilitate and, hurt them, essentially. But right now, in this moment in time, we're actively working to defund the police. We, as the protest started, and we mourn and still are mourning the loss and the murder of George Floyd, we transitioned into organizing even more intentionally because we have different kind of rungs of things that we have been organizing around for the past 3 years. And it jumped into and transitioned. So we're not a direct service organization, but we have been directly supporting other folks on mutual aid. And we have a fund that actually is currently handing out, it's closed now, but has given out $700,000 to folks that are on the ground working on things. And as the protest popped off, it's also just a moment of like, I think also we've been sitting with like, this only happens, right? When Black death happens, people put money into something, and really sitting with the fact that that is super unfortunate and terrible that like, this is how, like what gets people to move, and see that like liberation is necessary. Since then, we've had the city council agree and also like publicly make statements to defund the police. And right now we're working on getting the city charter changed, which is technically like the the city's constitution, because it's written into our city's constitution that we need to have a police department. And so police have never served us, and were not created for the intention or purpose that they are still being used for today. And yeah, that's mainly what we've been working on right now is also, I think there's just like a broad variety of different types of protests that have been occurring. I think our crew specifically it's more strategy based and intentionally focused on the goal of abolition. And but I thought it was really beautiful how the city transformed and changed, and how everyone was acting upon their feelings, their rage, their emotions, and how like it was such a fractal moment of where lots of these folks stepped into their leadership in this time, and it was so necessary to see.
Thank you so much, Sophia. We really appreciate your making the time to be with us. We'll now take questions. If people want to type in questions, they can do so in the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and typing in your question. I'll get started with the first question we have here from Vicky. I support the continued protesting and it has accomplished so much, but how much longer can it be sustained? Any responses to that question?
Is that for all of us?
It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. I'll open it up to anyone who would like to respond. Sophia, if you'd like to take a first crack at it, you're welcome to.
I'd like to respond to that one. Oh, I'm sorry. Sophia, did you want to respond first?
I have like a short response. I think that sustainability is really important, and that we've always taken care of our people. We have healers in community. We have other, mamas and aunties and daddies and all types of things that hold it down. And I don't think that even like it's about lives, right? Like our lives. And so I don't even know if there is like a stop or an end to like that, in general of like how long is it going to last. It's like, I know that our organization is like going to be fighting to abolish the police for as long as we exist. And also I personally will exist, in that, and like I am committed to like making sure that it's sustainable, and organizations and hubs and pods are also like committed to that as well. And so I think that that really supports the follow through.
And so I would add to that I think it should be an ongoing thing. I think protests leverage pushing weak points, power points, should be part of an organized strategy that we use like going forward anyway. People are beginning, I feel, to live into their power and recognize their power. I would say in addition to that, there are a lot of ways to protest. Like I'm Black, I choose not to go out into the streets. I don't put my body on the line. I prefer to fight on the computer, like, because this is a choice that I make. And I'd also say when you're thinking about, one thing I forgot to mention about Arm in Arm earlier is that we're censoring racial and economic justice, okay? But really figuring out what moving climate policy, intersectional climate policy, censoring racial and economic justice and equity. And part of that equity also shows up from protesting. So like as a person of color, a Black person, it's not equitable for me to put my body on the line. It's not a thing. And so I would say, in addition to that, there are other ways people can protest. There are ways people can protest with their money. Financial activism is a thing. Even the rally that was last week, people buying up tickets so people can't show up. I mean, and even one of my colleagues who's in Arm in Arm on the National Core Support Team, people who are able to sew masks. I mean, this is where the creativity of the individuals living in their own communities can really shine. It's what you want it to be. You can raise money for a particular thing. I mean, there's so many different ways. And so that's one of the things that we're looking to try and like proliferate and help generate ideas with Arm in Arm. And I think another important piece of protesting that's a really important thing about right now is that companies are hurting right now. Everybody is actually more susceptible to work stoppages, protests, and like financial things than they were before. So any pressure points we can put on industries and, anything right now, like this is the time. So yes, to sustain protests, because we have to push this over the line, because the pushback that we're getting right now is centuries, more than centuries in the making. And so it's going to take literally all of us to push and push and push and push and push until we get it over the line.
I'd like to hop in on this as well and echo these sentiments and also point folks to the chat. I think that Helena Loper has got a good observation, which is They write, sustainability question is when a movement begins to shift into organizational structure. This is needed for effectiveness, but it can also become a controlling institution. So one of the ways I finished my observations were pointing out that we're headed into a general election, and that one way in which some of this energy will be channeled is into institutional politics. The question then is, does institutional politics take care of these issues? And the clear answer is no. So I think the question is, how is this protest in many modalities and as a lifestyle, one of Lindsay's points and one of Andrea's points respectively, how is it that those two features can be harnessed by broad communities over time in order to ensure that things may blip onto and off of the front page, but what's happening in the background is ongoing mobilization, ongoing connections, ongoing communications in a way that doesn't just say, as some of you may remember, I'm seeing like where we've got folks from, some of you all may remember what happened with the anti-war protests that were so prominent in 03, 04, 05, 06. And those protests went away when Obama was elected because people thought, oh, you know what? He vowed to end the war. He's our guy. He's got this. The fact is, drone strikes went up. And so it's important to recognize that the sort of social movement activity that helps influence politics and electoral politics, which is great, and we should be doing that and pushing in November, is also the same thing that can lead to complacency and for folks to say, somebody who I agree with is in the White House, and now the struggle no longer needs to happen at the grassroots in its many manifestations over time, which is back to Andrea and Lindsay's point. So just echoing those points and saying, it's finding these different ways to actually amplify voices, but not allowing these efforts to be co-opted by, let's say, institutional and party politics, just for example.
Thank you. I guess since we have Austin, let me ask you this question, and people, I know I'm skipping around in the chat a little bit. We have many groups and organizations with overlapping goals and activities. How should we think about effective coordination, especially if their agendas may vary? That was for you, Austin.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to say somebody else's name at the end, change your mind about who you wanted to ask that. This is a tough question. And so we know that one thing that moves the needle is when I mean, this was, I think, Andrea's point, and I amplified it in the chat, which is a 3.5% number. When 3.5% of any polity, any country or any city say, no, not in our name, not with us, nothing about us, whatever the claim is, when 3.5% show up, it moves the needle. Why? Because 3.5% is when it's not just me and a bunch of bearded guys who agree with me, but I've got to reach across big divides and get folks to agree with me. I got to reach across generational divides, ethnicity divides, all sorts of divisions that this country is rooted in have to get surmounted in order to get 3.5% of a population onto the streets, making an argument for something. But getting that many people across those many differences to speak in one voice is challenging. And so I think this is, I'm a professor, so I'm just going to talk a bunch and hope you forgot what the question was, because the answer is so hard. And the answer is that we need to find a way to represent all of the voices, all of the different voices that we bring to the table. These are voices that have been silenced in past struggles, right? And this is like one of the fundamental claims of intersectionality, is we need to represent all of these voices all the time in real time. Well, how do you do that? And then we all speak with one voice. And I think this is, we are in a moment right now where we're struggling with that answer at the largest scale ever, where it's not women's rights versus civil rights, as we've seen in earlier struggles. It's actually, how can we have a struggle that works for everybody? Well, what is that slogan? Well, it's not all lives matter. We need a slogan for that. And that's hard. And so I hope to have not answered, I don't know if I can't answer the question. I hope to have explained why that answer is the most important thing for us to be leading into as we try to answer it with our practice, as we mobilize across big differences to make big change.
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate that answer. I'll also take privilege and piggyback on that and say, again, as I said earlier, if you can see your struggle in someone else's struggle, then you'll likely help them fight against their struggle. Our problem is we see ourselves absent of one another's struggle. And one of the things that COVID should have taught us, if it didn't teach us anything else, we can ill afford to ignore the plight of others. We're all interconnected. What affects one affects the other, whether it be directly or indirectly. When we look at environmental justice and air pollution, the air still blows. You can plant pollution, but you can't contain it. The water still flows. You can plant pollution, but you can't contain it. So when a source of pollution does get planted, you best believe it's coming your way. Whether it's directly or it's indirectly, you gonna feel it. We are facing a climate crisis right now, mainly because of the sources of pollution. Nobody's speaking on them because of where they're located, and it's around Black and brown bodies. We've got to really consider how we look at anti-Blackness in our institutions, even in our institutions of faith. We need to look at how we consider anti-Blackness, anti-Black bodies, as well as anti-Black minds. And I'm done with my soapbox, and I'll give it back to Reb to go with the next.
Do you mind if I add 2 quick things to that as well? I promise to be short.
Go for it.
Thank you. 2 things. One, as a Black woman from the South, the way to work across groups that have similar missions is to pick up the phone and build a relationship. That is something that folks be trying to skip over. Don't do it. Don't do it. You got to get to know people. That's just the end of it. And I had someone very close to me tell me something that has stayed with me, and I hope it is helpful to you all, that racism looks different in the North than in the South, okay? In the South, they don't want you to have nothing, but they'll break bread with you. In the North, they want you to have stuff, they just don't want to break bread with you. So I think when you're talking about institutions and the hidden racisms and the ones that we don't know about, it's like really think about that for a second and ask yourself, like, who are you around? Who are you building relationships? Why and why not? And to like dig into that a little bit. So that's all I wanted to add.
All right, thank you for those responses. Great conversation. We have a comment here and a question from Peter, who is just looking for comments, I think, from the panelists on reactionary and violent forces, talking about armed private security forces, open carry civilian militia groups, and also, you know, the government making pipeline protests a felony. There's all these efforts to squelch peaceful protests. Any comments about all those different actions of suppression and violence that are going on?
I'm happy to hop in there, and then we can hear from Lindsay and Sophia. I'm sure have observations about this from their experience as well. But I think one of the puzzles here is whether or not these are shows of strength or weakness. And I think that's there's a tactical answer to the question, which is how do we work against those sorts of efforts. But I think the larger question in my mind is whether or not those efforts are actually a sign of a system that is grasping for increasingly robust and violent tools for doing the kind of work that broader silence and cultural complicity had previously accomplished. And so that's the thing I'm trying to figure out is we may shift into I'm curating an edited volume right now, and I've got a contribution that's about to go to press on sort of armed Black resistance. So is the next step essentially, as Charles Cobb's book sort of pointed out, re-weaponizing a civil rights movement, which is in the opposite direction of the nonviolent sort of approaches, or it's not in opposition to, but it's in tension in some ways with the way that we've thought of nonviolence thus far. So we might have a new conversation about what it means what self-protection means in Black Lives Matter and for marginalized and vulnerable and exploited communities. Or we may have a separate conversation simultaneously or in contrast about what it means when militias are arming, white militias are arming themselves. And so I think those are, again, I'm not answering questions, or I'm asking them, which is, are these dying gasps of a system that no longer sees its route to maintaining power as white complicity and police violence? And so the idea is that they need to take this into their own hands. Or is it actually the beginning of a new normal where essentially communities are increasingly weaponized, which sends us down a different sort of path? So I think that's the thing I've got my eye on. I don't have an answer, but that's what I'm monitoring at the present.
So I have a question that I'd like to raise to both Lindsay and Sophia, and I think it kind of gets to one of the other questions that was asked. Lindsay, how do you see Arm in Arm differentiating between Poor People's Campaign and Movement for Black Lives and others, and how do you see it interfacing? And the same question for you as well, Sophia. How do you see it? How do you see it operating outside of, and also how do you see it interfacing as well?
Sophia, you want to go first? I just spoke. Go ahead.
I mean, we have folks on our team that actively participate in Movement for Black Lives. I think that how we engage is like, I mean, Movement for Black Lives is national. There is just like a large difference between national work and like there shouldn't be, and local work, you know? And I think that that is something to just hold space for, is like our organization has it's very small, you know, it popped off as the uprising popped off, but like, I think that it's shifted and changed radically. And we are in a growth spurt, and Movement for Black Lives has been around, you know, and has been able to sit with a lot of their questions and has like transitioned and changed. And so they make strategy for national, which I think supports like local or works towards supporting local. But I think that like local organizing is just very different. It is not only narrative, you know, it is also deeply intertwined with like relational building and like nurturing and caretaking those relationships. And I think that also like the accountability, right? Like interfacing and accountability is very different as well. Because we are like directly in response and in relationship with people like on the ground, and we have membership. So our interactions with folks is just very different. But also I think like the intention, right, is to work towards something together, unified, with clarity of what that is, instead of like competing. I think that like I have a deep appreciation for like how all of those things do play into each other. But yeah, and then I also, the armed struggle situation, I'm like, you know, I think the I is different than the we. I think that there's a lot of people that are like, I am ready for armed struggle. And I think the we is a little at a different place right now. Because we do have a mass amount, an army. There is it's a police state. It's a, you know, military. There's so many levels and layers to like what that looks like. And like, how do you take care of grandmas? How are you gonna like make sure, you know, there's a lot of places in South Side Minneapolis right now and North Side and in St. Paul that are burnt down. How are we making sure like grandparents and other people that like are, you know, their medications aren't accessible right now? Like, what does it look like for all of that to be happening? It's a lot of planning. And I don't think that we have a lot of internal work before anything like that can transition and bloom.
No, I really appreciate that, Sophia. And what I would add to that, you said it, the we. Arm in Arm is looking to broaden the we. People, individuals are down for the cause, but don't see the collective power and what it's going to take to move the actual thing. And so what we've been working on is and I'm gonna put this in the chat so you can kind of see, Arm in Arm was looking to broaden the we. Oh yeah, prisons do not disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. You can say that again. Thank you, Sophia. So I would say that Arm in Arm is definitely like an and. Arm in Arm is not looking to compete with any of the existing movements. That's not what this is. For instance, when the protests happened after George Floyd was killed, Arm in Arm got behind in solidarity with Movement for Black Lives. So again, I was talking before about how you censoring racial and economic justice and like operationalizing that. So again, it's an opportunity to get behind in action and model what we are talking about as far as getting behind like intersectional movements. I would say that again, or Arm in Arm is not to organize organizations, but more individuals per se. That's not to exclude organizations, but this is about the individual people, and understanding that in order to scale, it's going to take a lot of little individual groups, but not everything has to be 10,000 people, 5,000 people at every event. It's going to take small people with their kids, you know, with their aunts and uncles to getting this stuff done to really scale this stuff. And I also saw a comment in the chat around funding, and I think this kind of goes along as far as like interfacing with existing things. I think one of the things that I've learned in doing work in the South is that, you know, funders are paying more and more attention to groups that come together to do fundraising that have a broader, larger goal. And, you know, in the South, we've been historically underfunded for generations. And so we're always trying to get to the bigger dollar amounts. And I think that that's something that we can continue to model going forward, especially when we're talking about more coordinated action. Is something that groups can come together and kind of think about and strategize to get that sustained movement for the 3.5% we were talking about. And I can say there are additional conversations that we were having with the groups that you mentioned to really figure out how we Arm in Arm stay in our lane and help support existing work. Because we're not trying to add no more work to nobody's plate. I used to be in grassroots. That's not what this is about. This is about getting to the win at the end of the day.
Thank you so much for those responses. I think we have time for one last go around. And so just looking at the questions, a couple of them are kind of future oriented. We've got a question that's about, you know, what does it kind of mean to be in this tipping point moment? Another question is really looking at the local level in Minneapolis, Sophia, about where do you see things going with the defund the police abolition movement and kind of the immediate term. So I guess the question for all of our panelists is just to reflect on how you see things, your assessment of where things are going to be going in the next few months or the next year, and where there's some potential for us who are concerned about social change and bringing about a better world.
I can respond to the Minneapolis. I think, let me pull it up. I want to see what the, I mean, yes. So the city charter is hopefully being changed. It's kind of a sprint right now, right? We're working on holding folks accountable. We are working with city council members to push to get the city charter changed. And then, you know, there's all these hoops, right? It could have been the process of getting 10,000 signatures, and they all have to be checked on to make sure that the signatures are from the people that signed it. But instead, because of timing, we are hoping to get it on the ballot, and we're working on language right now alongside with Reclaim the Block folks and some amazing lawyers and the city council members to get the language right, because we really want to make sure that this is not just a reiteration of the police, and that it is something totally new, and it resides and lives within healing justice and transformative justice, and really serves the purpose of community-led safety. Do you see Frey and the whole? Yeah, so the city council has committed publicly to it, but we are working towards the ballot, and I think that it's going to be a lot of work, you know, and it's a lot of on the ground. Like, I encourage people in Minneapolis and beyond to have these conversations about visioning, you know, about what truly abolition means and what are the possibilities of life beyond policing. And I'm not talking about moving from like policing your own neighborhood. I'm talking about real safety. What are the needs that need to be met? And how is this money being transitioned and transferred over to those things, right? I know that there is over 48,000 people waiting on the list for affordable housing right now in Minneapolis. Like, that's a problem. We have a houselessness crisis here. My father was houseless for 15 years of his life in the cities here. And so I think that like those are the things that we need to have conversations about. And that's the real push, is like the on the ground work of like being intentional and like being uncomfortable and really pushing people beyond like what they know, and into a place of like, what can we transform into? And also like, it's gonna be uncomfortable, right? Be prepared to be uncomfortable, be prepared to scratch your knees a little bit and get back up, and it'll heal, you know? And the scar that like comes there is actually more strong than like what was there previously. And the fact that like, we're gonna go through it, not around it, you know? It's like, we're gonna go through it and it's gonna take time. And so I think that, yeah, that's where we're at right now, is pushing forward and having intentional conversations with folks.
Thank you all. This one last question before we end this call. How, because you're dealing with, or you're talking to faith leaders and other leaders of organizations and whatnot, how can we be involved? How can we get involved in what you all are doing, and how can we contact you as well? Don't jump over yourselves answering.
I think this is really Sophia and Lindsay's space as people who are on the ground doing this work. I threw my contact, my social media stuff in the chat as somebody requested, but I think it's finding ways to apply pressure both at the grassroots level, building solidaristic sort of communities, as has been pointed out. This is like classic community organizing stuff. Pick up the phone and call somebody. Who are you trying to work, what are you trying to change? Make those folks uncomfortable. I mean, this is like classic community organizing work. And for communities of faith, this involves, I think, uncomfortable and perhaps conversations and new relationships in our community. So it's a community level, but it's also working at levels that are networking more broadly, nationally or internationally, and then also the public policy and politics really matter at the national level as well. So it's somehow keeping the movement pressure up while also making sure that we don't lose sight of how we can be changing policies as we move forward. But that's my macro academic hat. And I really think that Lindsay and Sophia have the real answer in terms of other folks who are on this call.
So thanks for asking. I'm happy. I just put my social, it's Arm in Arm social media and my email address in the chat. Happy to connect with folks, answer folks' questions. I do want to say, I'm going to put it in the chat also. One, I see a question from Regina. You say you want to be mobilized and you want to act. My first suggestion, I'm going to put it in here, is you can sign the Arm in Arm pledge, and you can either join a hub or start a hub. We also have a hub structure. And so that would be something that I would suggest. And there's one more thing I was going to say, and I forgot what it was, and it might come back to me. I'll put it in the chat, but I'm going to put the link to the pledge. Oh, we have a training. If you're interested in being a trainer, someone who can train others in your community about kind of how we got into this situation, nonviolent direct action, anti-racism, how to talk media things, learn more about Arm in Arm. We have a training coming up in July. I have put that link in here as well. July 13th through the 16th for anyone who's interested in kind of plugging in. And again, there's my email address. You can shoot me an email, and I'm happy to chat with anyone who's got some more questions. And again, go Arm in Arm.
Thank you. How about you, Sophia?
Okay, well, my first ask is give grace and encourage other people to give grace, because people are still mourning, and like, we're also transforming and transitioning, and we're still in a pandemic. So encouraging grace is like my #1 ask for everything right now. But I think also just like having, like I said, have conversations. I want to have conversations with y'all. I would love to like hear and participate in conversations with like folks's, yeah, in your different communities, faith communities. I'm not going to say like a church, because not all faith communities have churches. Mosques, masjids, whatever may be, whatever space like you are in, like have those conversations, and like maybe have some study groups. I love study groups. Encourage folks to have like more intentional focused time of like study. And yeah, definitely reach out to me. And I think that's mainly it. Like, I mean, like also be educated about the politics in your city. I think that's the other thing too, because this is about fractals, right? This is about growing things from one place, but like we get to use what everyone is learning, you know? And so I would love to hear what y'all are doing and like what's working for you and networking, because I think that that is essential to a win, is like networking and learning from one another and understanding how much knowledge that each of us have, and really holding space for that. So I just have a lot of appreciation for y'all. Thank you for having us, and thank you all the folks for watching and all these good comments.
Thank you. Listen, as my call to action, or my closing call to action, I simply want you all to take this moment to get involved. I'll openly admit and gladly say that I am a trainer for the Arm in Arm. I'm one of the national trainers, and so I'm excited about Arm in Arm. And the reason why I got so involved in it is because I saw the connection that communities of faith can have with this particular form of protesting, because what it actually does is it allows you to do good and use your doing good to protest against the bad things that happen in society. And at the end of the day, that's what we are to do. Christ has said to us, let your light shine so that men can see your good works. And I believe that it's for us to allow for our lives to shine and for people to see our good works. And that way we're doing it. Again, I cannot stress this enough or not say it enough. It was Frederick Douglass that said, he who wants to be free must be willing to strike the blow. And at the end of the day, we've got to do something if we really want liberation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us, and look forward to getting an email with the recording as well as what we'll be doing next. Brooks, it's on you.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists. With gratitude, with grace, with action, we depart today. Thank you to all of you panelists, and for everyone in the audience, thanks for joining us. We'll be back a month from now. Our next topic will be the Green New Deal and reparations. That'll be our next webinar. So we are excited to be doing that. So that'll all be in the email that we send out this upcoming week as soon as we get things uploaded onto YouTube. So look for that. Thank you, everyone, and thanks again to our special guests.